we're so excited to have you all here today. In this session, we'll be introducing Azure Linux, which is now generally available on AKS as a container host. My name's Olivia. I'll be moderating this session. I'm a product manager too, and I spent the past 3 years on Azure Linux. And we have our two wonderful speakers, Jim and Sean.
Hey, I'm Jim Perrin. Some of you might have known me from community in the past. I've been building Linux distros now for close to 20 years, and have been with the formerly Mariner team and now the Azure Linux team for the last 3 years, give or take. So yeah. Sean?
And I'm Sean McKenna. I'm the director of product for AKS, so a customer of my friends here, and very excited to be announcing the GA of Azure Linux in AKS.
Great, so we'll just go over the code of conduct and a recording disclaimer, and then we'll talk about Azure Linux on AKS. We'll talk about how it's integrated, some value offerings, and then the majority of the session will be a Q&A where we'll open it up for questions. So this session will be recorded, so by being here, either in person or online, you're consenting to having both your image and your voice recorded. Microsoft's committed to empowering both individuals and organizations to have a respectful and inclusive environment. Our code of conduct prohibits any disrespectful, disruptive, or discriminatory behavior. In line with our code of conduct, we hope this session achieves getting your questions answered, hearing insights from others, and then collaborating and sharing experiences. Jim will introduce Azure Linux.
So for Azure Linux, what we've chosen to do is build an RPM-based distribution that allows a Azure-tuned and kind of customized focus on container platforms, making sure that all the typical Azure extensions that you would expect to have, all that stuff works basically built in. And it is a controlled and populated stack kind of from start to finish. So we take care of the platform from the VM on up. The AKS folks take care of the Kubernetes layer and the application stack above. We've been running this internally now for, I want to say, 1.5 years, 2 years. Initially under the CBL Mariner name for version 1. We've been running it with several teams internally, PlayFab, some of the few other folks that we've done blog posts with in the past whose names I'm blanking on now that I have a microphone in my hand. And after running it internally for a lot of teams, it seems kind of weird to just solve internal problems, and a lot of customers have some of the same concerns that the internal teams do, so open it up and make it available for everybody. John, anything you want to add?
I guess one thing from the AKS side, I don't know how many people know this, but obviously Kubernetes is an open source project, community-driven project, but we actually, when we run AKS, we build the Kubernetes binaries that run in AKS, so we build it from source. And so we've always had this situation where the operating system, the Linux operating system that is part of AKS is something that we don't build from source. We take, obviously with Ubuntu, we take it from Canonical, and so in this case, it's pretty exciting that now we've got a fully Microsoft-built operating system to complement the builds of the Kubernetes project that we run. And so being able to really deepen that support and the sort of the level of trust that we have in being able to control that whole supply chain is a big deal from our perspective.
And on the Azure Linux side, we, following what Sean said, we basically build everything from source as well, the entire distribution start to finish. The code for Azure Linux is public on GitHub. You can go to the former name, CBL Mariner, and the GitHub repository. You can follow along with what we're building. But this allows us to have a very defined, very opinionated Azure focus and to tune the components for the distribution to be exactly what we need to support for a container host and try to keep the dependencies, extraneous packages, things like that to a minimum. So we want to ship just the bare essentials for getting a Kubernetes cluster running. That kind of reduces the attack surface. It minimizes the random patches for, oh, Vim had another CVE, maybe you should patch. If that's not in the container host, there's no need to patch for it. So we're able to strip a lot of those components out, things like that, and basically make sure that the distribution is exactly what you need, nothing more, nothing less. Did we have other stuff? Anything else you want to go through?
I I can just mention, in addition to PlayFab, we also have Azure ML, Cosmos, and Azure Data Factory using Azure Linux, so close to 300 internal services. With our public preview in October, we had 100 enterprise customers using it. The biggest piece of feedback is that it wasn't disruptive for the end customer and that the node startup times were faster. I think that's all we have for this part. So main part of the session is a Q&A. If you're in person, feel free to just raise your hand and I can give you the mic to ask your question. If you're in the chat, you can put your chat or question in the chat, and we have a digital moderator that will be responding there. We can also read some and answer them in person. So yeah, feel free to ask any questions.
So the question was around ARM64 support in addition to x86 64 support, and the answer to that is yes, we do support both. We do have some internal customers using ARM64 images with AKS. I believe we also have a few external customers who've been running it as a part of our preview since October, since the announcement in October. It is not a lagging support issue. It is fully a tier 1 supported platform. So everything on the ARM64 side, if the code supports it, it's fully welcome on the platform, and we would happily have as many people use it as they want. Sean, anything you want to add for the ARM side?
No, not really, other than we're seeing a lot of interest in ARM deployments in AKS. And so, we look at it as Jim says, we want to have all of the capabilities of AKS supported on ARM, on Azure Linux as quickly as possible. And so, yeah, it's not something that it's a sort of tier 2 citizens by any means. It's there's so much excitement around using ARM with Kubernetes in Azure that we want to make sure that that's a first-class citizen.
Other questions from the audience? There are a couple of bare metal deployments using the Azure Linux tech and relying on Kubernetes. Those are very industry specific in their products. So AKS HCI, a few other platforms, Azure Nexus, things like that, they may use it for some bare metal instances. Azure Nexus, I think, is a bare metal implementation. AKS HCI uses it as a VM. Most of the implementation that we're talking about today is VM based. Because Azure, that happens to be Hyper-V related tech. I really don't have a preference one way or the other on the platform. It's a VM in the cloud that we're optimizing for that particular solution. I believe this would the AKS Essentials, I believe, pulls in the VM that would run Azure Linux, yes. Probably still under the old name for a little bit longer, but you'll see that transition happen. The question was, if I can restate your question, it was basically, is this a VM only? Is there bare metal offering? Is there support outside of the Azure related environment? So we are mostly targeting Azure adjacent properties. Okay, so one of the questions from the chat, I will take a slight bit of offense at this question, but yes. Is this Microsoft's version of Amazon Linux? It is a Linux distribution by Microsoft or by the Azure Edge and Platform team targeting Azure. You could roughly approximate it to an Amazon Linux. Like I said, I'll take a little bit of offense at the question, but not a ton. Azure Linux is the commercially supported offering for CBL Mariner. Yes, it is the same code base. Everything is there. The only real change is that this is a fully supported product by Azure.
I can't tell if this is meant as an OS for running containers or an OS for node pools. Both?
So this gets into a fun topic. The question is this for the container? Is this for node pools? The product is for node pools. The Azure as a container host, or Azure Linux as a container host, is for the node pools. You would be deploying this as a VM and then running your containerized workloads on top of that. Within Azure for Microsoft services, we do have teams who are running containers based on Azure Linux or based on CBL Mariner. That's more of an internal internal thing. The .NET team at previous Ignites and Builds has talked about what they're doing for building on top of it. They've had several releases around that. There are some container workloads that are used or that use Azure Linux, but it's not something that we're opening up for broader support in that case. We're not supporting container workloads. This is just for the VM and for the host. I like this question. So this question was, why Azure Linux over Flatcar? And this one kind of gets to why we initially started the CBL Mariner piece in the first place. We needed a Linux distribution internally. So we run a broad array inside Azure of various workloads. Some are VMs, some are container hosts, some are containers. We wanted a consistent platform for all of that for ourselves. So within Microsoft, within Azure, we use it in a number of places. That it's deployed as VMs. It's not just exclusively with AKS. And so that, to me, is part of the reason for why not Flatcar. Flatcar is a phenomenal container host. Flatcar is great for multi-cloud and on-prem support if you need to run it in that instance, but it's a container host. It doesn't have the same VM, general purpose VM capabilities or container capabilities that you would expect. The other side of that, I think, is you're probably selling the Kinvolk folks a little short just focusing on Flatcar. They had a lot of other good tech in there too. Anything you, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple comments. First of all, I love that we have this question at Build. The fact that we're getting a question about debating different Linux distributions that we invest in is pretty crazy compared to builds of years gone by. So that's just cool. And then, yeah, as Jim says, we are continuing to invest in Flatcar and, in fact, in the larger Kinvolk portfolio. We made an investment to acquire Kinvolk a couple of years ago with the intent of being able to take a lot of the technology and the expertise that they had in not only Kubernetes, but in eBPF and in Linux, and apply that in a number of different places. So in addition to Flatcar, which we're continuing to support as a community distribution, using Microsoft engineering resources, we've got the Kinvolk team working on things like integration of the Inspector Gadget toolchain into some of our diagnostics and observability tools, continuing to build out some of the tools like Headlamp as a tool for Kubernetes monitoring and management. And so there's quite a large portfolio of solutions that we're continuing to build out of that team.
So the next question is, what is our support for node image auto upgrade and expected frequency of new images?
You know this one. You can
so we do support node image auto upgrade, similar to other distributions in AKS. And the expected frequency of new images is usually about once a week. Unless there's like a critical CVE, then we might release the image sooner than that. What happened to Service Fabric, or did AKS take over?
All right, so now we've gone to the other end of the spectrum from debating Linux distributions. So I actually used to work on the Service Fabric team, so that's why I get to take the microphone on this one. Service Fabric is still heavily used internally at Microsoft. A good chunk of the core Azure resource providers are actually built on top of the Service Fabric platform, and that is the sort of the core of its reason for existence going forward, is to support Azure internal services. I think the reality is, we released Service Fabric as an external product around the time that Kubernetes was really taking a hockey stick growth, and so we decided to join in with that community momentum and really put a lot of our investment there as an external product. For those folks who have invested in Service Fabric as a platform externally, we continue to support it. It is still a commercially available service from Azure because we are continuing to invest in it internally. So I think the fact of the matter is, you won't see, and you probably haven't seen over the last, say, 18 months to 2 years, really heavy investments in sort of new flashy capabilities in Service Fabric. Those have much more come into sort of the Kubernetes side of the house, but we're continuing to support it as a sort of core platform. So that's kind of the story there. I would say if you're starting a brand new project today, I would definitely recommend to go with AKS as kind of the product that is getting the bulk of the investment as an external platform. But if you're on Service Fabric today, there's no sort of urgency to move off of it.
Next question is, when there's a 0-day patch for core Linux kernel, what's the turnaround time to see the patch applied to Azure Linux / how do I deploy it to my AKS cluster in an automated fashion? Do you want me to take this one? So for critical CVEs, our SLA is 72 hours. So what I would recommend is having DNF automatic turned on as well as Cure deinstalled so that you can get the patch automatically and then it will reboot to apply the kernel patch.
Yep. I'll put a little bit of nuance on the 72-hour piece. That's from the time that the fix is available, patching. We've got some testing that needs to happen within that. Most times for a kernel critical CVE, something like that, we work with the upstream kernel teams. Microsoft has several kernel developers that we have on staff kind of for this reason. If we are able to work with the upstream community in an embargoed fashion and get the patch ready early, great. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. If that's not possible, if there's a lag in the LTS kernel patch landing, things like that, you may see some difference in the time. But the 72-hour piece is basically how long it takes us to roll the patch out to all the regions, get everything plugged in. That's basically when you'll see it land in packages.microsoft, things like that. There's a couple of different AKS update methods. If you're just doing the node images, you'll see it when the next node image is available. If you're doing package-based updates, there's a service that runs on the distro, basically on I believe a nightly basis, that will pull that package in nearly immediately. And then if you're using something like CureD, it'll trigger the reboot for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. One, community around Azure Linux. Can I get it? How do I get it? And are you looking to develop community around the distribution in the same way that you do that other Linux distributions have? Second question is, there was a comparison with Azure Linux earlier. Azure Linux traditionally is a rebuild of CentOS or Fedora now. What distribution is Azure Linux a rebuild?
Sure. So there was two questions. The first was, do we have a community around Azure Linux? And if so, how are we planning to build that community? And then the second question was, what was the second question? Sorry.
So Amazon Linux is a rebuild of CentOS.
Yes.
Which distribution is that?
What distribution is Azure Linux based off of?
I'm going to chew on the answer for this one. So Azure Linux is its own separate distribution. We did not take from other distros. We didn't fork CentOS. We didn't fork Fedora or anything like that. We have borrowed code from them. It's an RPM-based distro. We've borrowed spec files from Fedora. That kind of helped us bootstrap faster. Where we've done that, we do mention it in the code that we have borrowed from other distros. I think it's basically just SUSE, or there's one or two packages from SUSE that we borrowed the spec files from, same for CentOS, and a couple more from Fedora. For the most part, the reason we chose not to fork a different distro or work through, Debian, CentOS, something like that, Microsoft has kind of a history with Linux. Some people may be aware of it. I don't know. Those quotes and that animosity, those are old enough to drink now. That I think the Ballmer quote was from like 2001. But a lot of the sentiment still lingers even today. And so part of the reason we did not choose to start with a distribution and then fork it for our needs is we didn't want to be seen as doing the embrace and extend thing again. We didn't want to wake any of that up. We figured build it from scratch. We can tailor it to our needs. We're making the changes as we need to. And frankly, it's kind of what the Linux ecosystem is about. We're scratching an itch we had and offering the solution back to the community. To your question around community, the code that we're building the distro from is completely open and available on GitHub. We have had a couple of contributions from community members into the distro. I would very much personally like to build more community around it. That is something that I think for ecosystem environment would be beneficial, but that's something that takes time and basically resourcing to kind of build up and put together. So that is the long-term plan. That will be something that we do, but it's going to be a bit before we're fully in that space. There's nothing stopping people from contributing or trying to submit it. I would point out it is an opinionated distro. If you put something in there for like, oh, we need this for support on-prem, if it's not a use case we're supporting, we may look sideways at that patch. But if it's something that helps out, if it's a package people are asking for, yeah, by all means, throw a pull request in. We'll see what we can do.
Okay, next question. Could you also expand on the Azure optimized kernel lifecycle? Does Microsoft maintain a single kernel across all product offerings, maybe with cherry-picked configurations?
I kind of want one of our kernel people here to talk a little more correctly or in depth about this one. But Microsoft, the Linux systems group has an Azure tuned kernel that gets taken every year from the newest upstream LTS kernel. Patches for Azure get baked into that kernel. Those patches are all primarily upstream as well. We're not hiding the ball from anybody in source code in that respect. The configurables for Azure and other Microsoft services are put in that, and that kernel gets maintained currently, I believe, for 2 years. It might be a little bit longer. I'm not sure on the timelines for that one. From that point, some internal teams roll to the newest LTS every time the LSG group makes that kernel available. Some teams, like Azure Linux, pin to a specific version for the life of the distro. So for our Azure Linux 2 release, we started with the 5.15 kernel. We're going to stay on the 5.15 LTS for the distro. When we start doing our 3.0 development, we'll roll to the next LTS release for that side of the house. Does that answer the question? Were there other things in there they wanted to hear about?
Can users install their own tools on Azure Linux and possibly save them?
It's a container host. You shouldn't be installing things directly on the container host. Sorry, that was like the Kubernetes community requires that I say that sort of thing. In theory, yes, you could install your own tooling on that if you wanted to. If we don't ship it, it's going to be challenging for us to support it. I would dare say we probably wouldn't support it in that use case. But the code is open source. If you want to, you're welcome to try. It's just the question of whether or not when you call or if something breaks, who answers the phone or who's on the hook for fixing it. Anything you want to?
Yeah, which is basically the same statement that we have with Ubuntu, right? And we know, I mean, despite Jim's disclaimer, which he is actually, yes, contractually obligated to say, we know that in practice, a lot of folks do end up, running privileged daemon sets to do installation of or configuration of the underlying operating system. And so likewise, you'll be able to do that here. But technically, sort of per our support policy, if you end up sort of breaking the operating system as a result, there's going to be only so much that we can do. At that point, you've sort of gone beyond what the support policy is able to cover. I guess the other points are related to that would be, and this sort of dovetail into the future of Ubuntu, just to be super clear, the intent is that we will continue to support Ubuntu indefinitely within AKS. And so for folks who have already done some of those customizations on the Ubuntu side and are thinking like, oh, I've really built out a fully sort of bespoke OS image via a series of privileged daemon sets, that will continue to be supported indefinitely. There's no reason necessarily that you need to think about how to sort of redo that on top of Azure Linux. Certainly would love for you to take it for a spin, but there's no real reason why you would need to move off of Ubuntu. We'll continue to support that within the service because we know there's obviously a lot of customers that are looking to have multi-cloud consistent deployments, and I think Ubuntu is sort of the de facto standard for those multi-cloud deployments.
Awesome. And then one more question, is the kernel running C group v1 or v2 by default?
We support both. I think the default for the time being is still V1 until AKS, what is it, 125 switch to V2? I think 125 switches to V2. We default to V1 currently. V2 support is there in the distribution. It's basically just where in AKS the bit gets flipped for support. I want to say it's after 125 that would be on, but I think we're waiting for 124 to drop off before we flip the default, just because we don't want people to run the container host with a C group version that isn't fully supported and then have a bad user experience. That's the thing that we're trying to avoid.
No questions from the audience? Another question, what's the default OS disk size for Azure Linux on AKS? I hope this will ease the use of ephemeral OS.
I believe the image size or the disk size is the same as the Ubuntu version. I believe it's 30 gigs all the way across. The distribution usage of that disk is a bit reduced. The base VHD that the container host gets built from is around 350 megs, I think, and I want to say the full container host with everything is maybe 700 megs, something like that. Don't quote me on the size. I'm being a bad PM at this point for not having those memorized.
Documentation is for.
It is. It's slightly smaller. I know we have this in the documentation. I just can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
I think that's all that we have in the chat right now, but I have a question. What is the future of Ubuntu on AKS?
Yeah, so I think I covered that briefly, but again, to reinforce, we are going to continue to support Ubuntu. And so basically we will have 3 fully GA'd operating systems between Ubuntu, Azure Linux, and Windows Server. And ultimately, the goal, and this sort of relates back a little bit to the ARM question earlier, the goal from the AKS side is that when we build new capabilities in the service, those automatically just accrue to all of the different OS distros that we support. We've been working pretty hard on making that statement true for Windows Server. It's actually, I think, going to be largely easier in the case of Azure Linux, because they are still both Linux distributions, but that is ultimately the goal for AKS, so that you don't have this very sort of segmented experience where, oh, you see a new feature that gets announced for the service, and it's like, oh, no, that's only for Ubuntu, and it'll come to Azure Linux 6 months later and to Windows Server 6 months after that. Our goal is to have those capabilities, to the extent possible, land across all OS distros sort of simultaneously, or at least very, very much fast follow. And ultimately, honestly, the goal from the AKS side is that the OS distribution actually fades to the background as much as possible, right? Part of the value of running containers is that you actually don't need to care about the underlying operating system as much as you may have in the past. And so we want to just kind of make it sort of part of the background fabric, if you will, but just be something that's, you can sort of sleep easier at night, I guess, in knowing that it's a much smaller image, smaller attack surface, that it's been built from source by Microsoft, but otherwise your applications kind of just work the way they always did, and you're not really going to see any dramatic difference kind of one way or the other. And so, like I said, we'll continue to have support for Ubuntu indefinitely. I don't see any scenario in which we would ever remove it, just given the popularity of that distribution, particularly for customers that are looking to run multi-cloud. So yeah, no real change in that respect. I guess the other point there is, as of today, even though we're announcing GA of Azure Linux, Ubuntu will remain the default operating system. So if you just go and create a node pool without indicating that you want to run Azure Linux, you will still get an Ubuntu node pool as of today, and that's just to sort of maintain that consistency with where we are. As we have a GA of Azure Linux and we see additional external usage, we'll see how that may evolve over time. But as of today, there's no change to sort of that default behavior.
Thank you. Pretty important question here. Any cool mascot for Azure Linux? And then it says, think of the swag.
Not yet. this might be one of those areas. No, I don't want to open that can of worms. I was going to say this could be an area for community contribution, but I really don't want to see what the community would. No, please no. You know, I've seen what some of the AKS engineers were recommending for logos and stuff. We'll sort that out with brand. I really don't want the brand people to know me by like site. That doesn't feel like a good thing. Yeah, that's a good one. So the question was around space and performance optimizations for Azure Linux. With respect to the kernel, yes, there are some Azure tuned features in the kernel. Those just help general performance, networking, things like that for kernel. Newer iterations of the mana driver that may land upstream, things like that. We're working with a number of networking partners to help get support in place for some of the network cards, NVIDIA, Mellanox, things like that, for some of the Azure SKUs where that kind of offload is required. From a space savings perspective, most of the time it is just being very intentional about how the distribution is built. For distributions, RHEL, Fedora, Ubuntu, there's a lot of general purpose stuff baked into them, graphical interfaces, things like that. We don't have those. We're targeting the cloud environment fairly heavily. So those dependencies aren't there. That additional code weight isn't there as a result. Things like stripping Vim and some other packages out of the image help as well. So it does come down to trying to get to that kind of minimal place. For the initial launch, we're looking just to give customers a good, consistent starting point that they can feel comfortable with. And then in the future, we do intend to optimize that a bit further, see what else we can look at reducing. Some of the ideas that we have been kicking around have been things like an immutable host, basically read-only updates, things like that. There are no firm plans for that yet. These are just ideas that we're working through in collaboration with the AKS team. As Sean called out earlier, it is a partnership. It's basically the two teams needing to sit down and identify what features are valuable, which features would resonate with customers, following the customer demand, and then figuring out how to go build it. I did not mention pre-release testing as a part of this, and this is one thing that we should bring up. As a part of the Azure Linux testing, we run our own set of integration tests before we release packages. We run them through a kind of shorter version of the AKS testing pipeline internally. We do some smoke testing there to make sure that things pass QA validation. This comes back to the patching thing. If a patch fails validation, we're obviously not going to release it. Once that patching is done, we turn the package over to the AKS team. When the AKS team takes the image or takes the package updates, they run everything through their full suite of automation testing. So you're basically validating that things work twice, and it's two different teams. We validate it once, they validate it once. Hopefully, if something is amiss in there, one of the two teams has caught it, notified the other team, hey, there's a thing, and that should generally lead to better stability longer term.
Question, will Azure Linux be part of AKS LTS?
We were literally just talking about that right before the session. So we're working through the details on that just to kind of bring everybody up to speed, because it's a fairly recent announcement from our side. We made it at KubeCon EU and in Amsterdam a few weeks ago. A bunch of people probably know the Kubernetes project itself maintains support for minor releases for a period of 1 year, and then they go out of support. AKS historically has kept in lockstep with that upstream cadence. We'll basically take new minor releases into the service, usually within a few weeks of the upstream release into preview, and then ultimately to GA, and then similarly sort of on the back end as they drop out of support upstream, we'll drop them out of support from the managed service. That's been a challenge, frankly, for a lot of customers to maintain that type of release cadence, because there is some amount of process that goes into consuming new Kubernetes upgrades, particularly if you fall back a few versions and then try to catch up, there can be quite a bit of sort of operational headache that goes into that. And so we announced at KubeCon EU that we will be offering actually the industry's first LTS support for Kubernetes. So actually starting with version 127, which is just released into the service, we will offer an additional year of support beyond what the community support covers. So 1 year of the community support, which is basically what you have today, and then we will extend that for chosen releases. So initially with 127 for an additional year. So a total of 2 years of support. What that means is we will actually go and take bug fixes and CVEs, patches from the later versions of Kubernetes, and we'll cherry pick them and bring them back into that LTS release, which is something that the community at large will not be doing. And so the question around alignment with that is, we want to try to make sure that Azure Linux is sort of operating in lockstep there, so that when we say that particular Kubernetes release has got an additional year of support, that the sort of associated Azure Linux version has that same level of support. And this is actually, it's part of a larger conversation that we're trying to work through, frankly, around LTS, which is kind of how far do we extend the scope of what we can promise there. Initially, the initial announcement is really around just Kubernetes itself, but ultimately we'd love to think about how do we provide sort of LTS certification for popular ecosystem packages. So we just GA'd the Kubernetes Marketplace, for example, today with a bunch of ISV solutions that are supported in there. We'd love to be able to say that those solutions have LTS support as well. And so there's a bunch of these sort of ancillary complementary pieces to Kubernetes that we would love to tie into the scope of that LTS offering. And those are some of the questions we're going to be working through here over the next year. So we've got a year between when 127 has just come out to when it's going to drop out of community support to really refine some of these details. And so certainly the Azure Linux tie-in is going to be a big one for us to nail.
Thanks. Another question, do you have any guidance for customers looking to use Mariner as a Distroless base image for containers?
I would reiterate for the, at least for right now, the container side of things is not an officially supported use case. That said, they are open source, they are published. If you want to, by all means, you can go use them. We're just not officially supporting them. For the people who do use the distroless containers, the best way is basically to do a multi-stage build so that you're installing just the pieces that you need. So you would take the default base container, the kind of full weight version, use that to add the components that you need for your application into the base container or into the distroless container as kind of a multi-stage build, and then produce the final distroless container from that. That's pretty much the easiest way to do it. Yeah, the .NET team has actively published their Docker files and things like that that show how to build or enable the distroless containers.
Okay, one question here. What do you want us to know about Azure Linux that we have not yet asked?
That's interesting. Do you have anything you think they should know?
Built by a lot of cool people. You covered like the value offerings, how it's integrated seamlessly in AKS. I guess like for migration, if that's something you're looking forward to, in our documentation we have that published. Basically, you can delete your cluster and recreate a new one with Azure Linux, or you can just add a new node pool into your existing cluster and then cordon and drain them. So it's a pretty simple migration path. And then Sudhanva dropped some useful links for folks. Thank you.
Possibly not to the end.
Yeah. Actually, let me go to the next slide.
Other questions? This is a quiet group.
Yeah.
Dave, any other questions you want to?
Cool.
I will put more audience members on the spot.
Well, if you'd like to learn more, oh, go ahead.
There it is. We made a bet. $1.
I was joking as we got in here like 10 minutes before the session, like, Jim, okay, we got 10 minutes to figure out an AI angle, and we failed. So you can ask ChatGPT about why you should use Azure Linux on AKS maybe and see what answer it comes back with. I guess the only thing I would maybe add is there's been a few questions about, hey, do you have plans to do X, Y, Z with Azure Linux kind of going forward? I think, Jim's outlined the scope of what it covers today. I think we would say we want to keep those types of questions coming, right? So if there's interest in, for example, we heard a couple times the idea of using it as a container-based image, let's continue to have those conversations because we want that feedback. We want to help sort of use that to prioritize the roadmap. So even though we don't necessarily have immediate plans on some of these things, don't take that as sort of we want to end that conversation. We're trying to open the dialogue there on sort of where we should go next with some of these investments.
If there are features that you would like to see, specific workloads, if you want to see us support containers, I'm a PM at heart. I'm going to follow customer demand. If you tell me you want supported containers, my job is to go back to my leadership and say, hey, we've got customers demanding this. Let's make it happen. Yep, that is part of the challenge, especially with this build session or this entire kind of build lineup. There's a lot of AI focus. And at the platform level, that is challenging. How quickly you can scale, how far you can scale, things like that will matter. We will work with the AKS team to make investments there, but at the platform side, there's not a ton for AI. It's more, are we enabling GPU compute, which is a thing that we have. We're going to continue expanding that. So from that angle, yes, you can do some GPU offload work within AKS using Azure Linux. That is there. Like that side of the house is supported. But if you're trying to use TensorFlow or PyTorch or some of the other kind of ML focused things, those are more container based. That's what's going to run on top of the platform rather than the platform itself. So we're going to work to enable that sort of stuff. I'm not sure what we would have in the distribution itself beyond specific offload or trying to make sure the right kernel configuration is in place for networking, for GPU compute, things like that. So we want to make sure we're the best place for it, but as far as what we have for it specifically, it's a platform. It'll be challenging to integrate there. The not a question, more of a statement kind of thing was a ChatGPT plugin for node health. I would expand in that for, maybe flake analysis, auto-generating, hey, this node smells like it might fail in the future. Let's just move stuff off of that proactively. Those are the sorts of things that we would need to talk through for the AKS team. That is both a Kubernetes angle and a lower level platform side.
Yeah, and you'll see in some of the AKS sessions this week, things exactly along those lines where ultimately what we want to do is provide you that sort of intelligent assistant that can help you navigate the challenges of Kubernetes of like, hey, my application is just not working. And I don't know at what layer of the stack the problem is. I don't necessarily know of all the different diagnostic data that I could be looking at to figure out where I should even start. And I'm just going to describe the problem that I'm seeing in natural language. And I would like something to help me sort of navigate that huge amount of data and different data sources. And so that's the type of thing that we're driving towards. And so, to the extent that Azure Linux is one of those sources of diagnostic data and potentially one of the sources, I don't think Azure Linux would ever be the source of an application failure because it's, stable and rock solid. But at least, it would be included in that type of experience. So you'll definitely see that at sort of the broader AKS level for sure.
So we're actually at time. I'm just going to quickly run through this. We have our GA blog at aka.ms/Azure Linux. Be sure to read that. If you want to learn how to get started, troubleshooting guides, etc., we have some docs on learn.microsoft.com. Any issues as they arise, please report them on AKS's GitHub page or just create a support ticket in Azure portal. If you're curious about actually how to build Azure Linux yourself, you can visit our GitHub page, which is linked there. And then lastly, we'll just be in the next room for Ask the Expert if you have more questions. So thanks, guys.